On July 6, 1973, an 11-year-old girl in Corona del Mar, California, put on a dress her mother had sewn for her. Light blue flowers, dark blue trim. She pulled her hair into a ponytail, put on her white ankle socks, slipped on her dark blue shoes, and walked out the door into a California summer morning. Her name was Linda Ann O'Keefe. She was 11 years old. She loved painting and piano and the beach. She was a Girl Scout. She was the middle child in a family of 5, and she was, by every account, exactly the kind of kid who makes a family work. That morning, her piano teacher picked her up for summer school at Lincoln Intermediate in Corona del Mar. When school ended, Linda didn't want to make the walk home alone. She went to the office and used the phone. She called her mother. Her mother, Barbara, was home. She was sewing. She told Linda she was busy. She told her to walk. That phone call lasted less than a minute. It was the last time Barbara O'Keefe heard her daughter's voice. Linda walked out of the school and turned toward home. A turquoise van was seen stopping beside her. Once, then again. She never made it home. The next morning, 1 mile from the O'Keefe house, a man had taken his 4-year-old son to a nearby lake to look for frogs. In the cattails along the back bay, he saw a hand. He reached out and touched it. He thought she was sleeping. He screamed, trying to wake her. She didn't move. Linda O'Keefe's body was found on the morning of July 7, 1973. She had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and strangled. She was still wearing her ponytail. She was still dressed in the light blue flowers and dark blue trim her mother had made her. The man who put her there got back in his van and drove away. For the next 46 years, nobody knew his name. Before July 6th, there was just Linda. She had lived her whole 11 years in the beach communities of Southern California, and she carried that place in the way she moved through the world. She loved lying out in the sun. She loved the water. She was a California kid in the fullest sense. Unhurried, easy, tuned to the rhythm of a place where summer doesn't announce itself because it never really leaves. She was shy, not withdrawn, just careful. The kind of kid who watched a room before she entered it. She painted. She played piano seriously enough that her teacher picked her up for lessons during summer school. Her mother said she loved to express herself through drawing, that she had a real talent for it, the kind that surprised you when you saw it. She kept her room immaculate. Not because anyone made her, but because that was just Linda. She'd finish cleaning and go find her mother and ask her to come look, to confirm it was right. She normally rode her bike to summer school. But on July 6th, her piano teacher was already coming. So Linda left the bike. She got in the car instead. It was a small decision. The kind you make 100 times without ever thinking about it. Her mother was home that day sewing. The dress Linda wore, light blue flowers, dark blue trim. Barbara O'Keefe had made it herself. She was still at that machine when the phone rang and Linda asked for a ride. She told her to walk. When the last class ended, Linda went to the office and asked to use the phone. She called her mother. Barbara was at her sewing machine in the middle of something. The call was short. She told Linda she was busy. She told her to walk. Linda hung up and walked out of the school. A friend who was outside watched her leave. At some point along her route, a turquoise van appeared. It didn't pass her and keep going. It stopped. It moved up alongside her, then stopped again. The friend watched it happen more than once. The van pulling up, pausing, moving on, then pulling up again. Linda kept walking. At some point she stopped. Whether she was spoken to, whether she was simply grabbed, none of that is in the record. What is in the record is that Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old, alone on a street in Corona del Mar, and a man in a turquoise van decided she was who he wanted. The van pulled away and drove toward the back bay, the stretch of wetlands and cattails and dirt trails that sat less than a mile from the O'Keefe family home. Linda never walked through her front door that afternoon. Her family waited. The afternoon turned into evening. Evening turned into the kind of night where you stop telling yourself there's a reasonable explanation and you pick up the phone and call the police. They searched through the dark. 1 mile from Linda's house, in the cattails at the edge of the back bay, a man looking for frogs with his 4-year-old son found her. The turquoise van was gone. The man who drove it was gone. And on the ground, in the dress with the light blue flowers and dark blue trim, was an 11-year-old girl who had asked her mother for a ride home and been told to walk. The man came with his 4-year-old son to look for frogs. That was all it was supposed to be. He was moving through the cattails when he saw the hand. He reached out and touched it. He thought she was sleeping, that there was a girl lying in the reeds and she had fallen asleep somehow, and he needed to wake her up. He screamed, trying to get her to stir. She didn't respond. He took his son and called the police. What investigators found was an 11-year-old girl lying in a ditch in the Back Bay wetlands, less than a mile from her house. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The dress her mother had sewn for her was still on her body. She had been left there like something discarded, set down in the cattails where the reeds grew tall enough that you wouldn't see anything unless you were already close. Whoever put her there was gone long before anyone found her. There were no witnesses to what happened in that van. No one who saw him walk back out of those reeds alone. Newport Beach police responded, and the search that had been about finding a missing girl became something else entirely. The case that opened on July 7, 1973 would stay open for the next 46 years. In 1973, there was no such thing as DNA evidence. If you worked a crime scene, you collected what you could see, cataloged what you could measure, and hoped that something in the physical record would point you toward a person you could put in front of a jury. What you could not do was look at biological material and extract from it the specific genetic identity of the person it came from. But a criminologist named Jim White had a framework for something else. He had a framework for patience. When Jim White processed the evidence from Linda O'Keefe's body in July of 1973, he collected and preserved the biological material the killer had left behind, not because he had a plan for it, because he understood that evidence was worth keeping even when you didn't yet have the means to read it. For many years, investigators didn't even publicly acknowledge that Linda had been sexually assaulted. The detail was withheld, and the biological evidence Jim White had collected sat quietly in storage while the investigation worked every other angle it had. Those angles didn't hold. Police canvassed the neighborhood. They followed up on the turquoise van. They looked at local men with records, anyone without a solid alibi. They worked the case the way you worked a case in 1973. None of it led anywhere. No suspect was ever named. No arrest was ever made. The turquoise van was never found. The file went onto a shelf. The evidence went into storage. And in a sealed container in a Newport Beach evidence room, the biological material Jim White had collected sat waiting for a science that didn't exist yet. It would wait 25 years before anyone could begin to read it. It would wait 46 before it said a name. The O'Keefe family didn't get to grieve and move on. Grief without resolution doesn't arc toward anything. It doesn't process and settle and become something you carry more easily with time. It stays open. A wound that never closes because closing would require something the case never gave them. Cindy Borgeson was Linda's older sister. She grew up in the years after July 7, 1973, watching her parents carry it. She carried it herself. She became the person who held Linda's story as the years accumulated and the case produced nothing. She didn't expect it to ever be solved. That wasn't bitterness. It was 46 years of watching a case go nowhere, of waiting for a phone call that didn't come. After long enough, you stop expecting the thing you've learned not to expect. And through all of it, at the center of everything, was her mother. Barbara O'Keefe had been home sewing on July 6, 1973. She had told Linda she was busy. She had told her to walk. It was the kind of thing a mother says in an ordinary afternoon without knowing it isn't one. She carried the guilt of that phone call for the rest of her life. Not the guilt of negligence. The guilt of a woman who had been one call away and made a small ordinary decision and lost her child because of the timing of it. That is a particular kind of weight. It doesn't respond to reason. It just sits there in the place where your daughter used to be. Barbara O'Keefe died in 2005, 32 years after July 7th. She died without ever knowing who drove the turquoise van. Richard O'Keefe died 3 years later, in 2008. He had outlasted his wife by 3 years and the investigation by 35. He died the same way, without answers, without a name, without the thing the case had never been able to give either of them. Both of Linda's parents went to their graves with the same open question they had carried since the summer of 1973. Cindy kept going. She kept Linda's story alive by refusing to let it be forgotten. She became the keeper of what Linda had been, the painter, the piano player, the Girl Scout with the clean room and the dress with the light blue flowers. She never really thought they would find the person responsible. 25 years after Jim White put that evidence into storage, the science finally caught up to what he had preserved. By the late 1990s, DNA technology had moved out of the laboratory and into the courtroom. Newport Beach investigators pulled Linda's case back out. The biological material Jim White had collected in 1973 was still there, still viable. The decision he had made on a July morning to preserve it carefully, without knowing what it would ever become, that decision was about to mean something. Investigators extracted a DNA profile from the sample and submitted it to CODIS, the FBI's national database of genetic profiles collected from convicted offenders. The principle was straightforward. If the person who left biological material at a crime scene had been convicted of a qualifying offense and submitted a DNA sample, the database would flag the match. The submission went in. The database ran its search. Nothing came back. The man who had driven that turquoise van was not in CODIS. Whatever his record looked like, he had never been entered into the system. The profile was logged and left to run automatically, checking against every new offender added to the database year after year, silent and patient. The year 2000 came and went, then 5 more years, then 10. Every year, new names entered CODIS. Every year, nothing came back on Linda's case. Newport Beach police kept her photograph on the wall of their department. Not as a symbol, just as a fact. She was still their case. Generations of investigators had picked up the same folder and kept going from wherever the previous detective had left off, which was nowhere. The profile ran. The years accumulated. The silence held. Somewhere out there, in a quiet life in a state that wasn't California, the man who drove that van kept waking up in the morning. He had been invisible in 1973. He was still invisible now. By 2018, Linda O'Keefe had been dead for 45 years. The detectives who worked her case in 1973 were retired or gone. The Back Bay was a nature preserve now, with walking trails and families and no visible trace of what had happened in the cattails on the morning of July 7th. Corona Del Mar had kept moving, filling in around the absence with new people who had never heard her name. Newport Beach police hadn't forgotten. The photograph was still on the wall. The file was still open. But open and moving are two different things. Then a former department spokesperson named Jennifer Manzella had an idea. She went to the police records. She sat down with Cindy Borgeson and listened. She gathered every documented detail and every detail only the family carried. The dress, the ponytail, the bubble gum from the store between piano lessons, the phone call to Barbara, the turquoise van. She built a minute-by-minute timeline of the last day of Linda O'Keefe's life. On July 6, 2018, exactly 45 years to the day, Newport Beach police began posting it to Twitter. Not as a department announcement. In Linda's voice. 68 tweets, written as though Linda herself was narrating her own last day in real time. The posts went out one after another, each one moving the clock forward, each one carrying the weight of what the audience already knew was coming. The department also posted photographs of Linda's clothing. Her dress, her shoes, her white ankle socks, the wardrobe of a child laid out flat. Small and specific and real in a way that a case number and a date never could be. It was also deliberate in another way. By describing those clothes in public, with 45 years of specificity behind every word, investigators were sending a message to whoever was still out there. We remember everything. We have always remembered everything. We are not done. The tweets reached people across the country. It did not produce the suspect's name. The man in the turquoise van was living quietly in Colorado by then, and the campaign did not move him. But it pushed the case back to the front. It created momentum where there had been stillness. And behind the scenes, the investigation was already moving towards something the Twitter campaign had helped make possible. Newport Beach investigators had carried the DNA profile since the late 1990s. CODIS had returned nothing. But by 2017, the landscape of forensic DNA had changed in ways that made Cody's look like only one tool among several, and not the most powerful one anymore. They sent the profile to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. Parabon was doing two things traditional analysis couldn't. The first was phenotyping, extracting a physical description of the suspect directly from his DNA. Eye color, hair color, skin tone, facial structure. From the biological material Jim White had preserved in 1973, Parabon built a portrait of what the suspect would have looked like at 25, then aged it forward to show what that same man might look like now in his 70s. Newport Beach released the images publicly. A composite of a man built entirely from DNA, from evidence that had been sitting in storage for 44 years. But Parabon's second capability was the one that would break the case open. Genetic genealogy worked on a completely different principle. Instead of matching a crime scene profile against convicted offenders, it uploaded that profile to public ancestry platforms, sites where millions of ordinary people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to trace their family history. If anyone in that database shared enough DNA with the crime scene sample, it meant they were biologically related to whoever left it. From there, genealogists could work backward through generations of records, building a family tree until the branches narrowed to a name. Newport Beach uploaded Linda's profile. In January 2019, the database returned a familial hit. Somewhere in that archive of ordinary people tracing their roots was a relative of the man who had driven the turquoise van. Someone who had submitted their DNA without any idea that a 45-year-old murder investigation was about to find its way to their family tree. The genealogists followed the branches. Census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death notices. They pruned as they went, eliminating lines that didn't fit, narrowing toward the person the DNA was pointing at. The tree pointed to a man living in Monument, Colorado. He was in his 70s. He had lived in Southern California in 1973. He had left after the killing, moved states, and changed his name somewhere along the way. Genealogy could place him on the right branch. But it could not prove he was the specific person who had left that DNA in 1973. For that, investigators needed something direct. They needed his DNA. And they needed to get it without him knowing they were looking. Detectives flew to Colorado. They didn't knock on his door. They didn't announce themselves in any way that would have told James Allen Neal that Newport Beach Police had spent 46 years working toward the quiet street in Monument where he had been living out his retirement. They watched him. They followed him through his ordinary days and waited for the moment he left something of himself behind. Something discarded. Something that carried the biological material they needed without him ever knowing they were there to collect it. At some point during that surveillance, Neal discarded something. Investigators recovered it, packaged it, and sent it to the laboratory. The result came back. The DNA matched the profile extracted from the biological evidence Jim White had preserved from Linda O'Keefe's body in July of 1973. 46 years. 2 samples. One source. The man who had driven the turquoise van had handed investigators everything they needed without knowing he'd done it. He had gone about his day, discarded something unremarkable, and walked away, the same way he had walked out of the cattails along the Back Bay on the morning of July 7, 1973, and kept going for the next 4.5 decades. His name at birth was James Albert Layton Jr., born in Chicago, July 1946. By later accounts, his upbringing was not a gentle one. His parents reportedly physically and psychologically cruel to him and his siblings. He carried whatever shape that left him in West. The family moved to California in 1956. He started getting into trouble young. By his 20s, he had a record, not occasional mistakes, but a pattern. He came to Colorado in 1966, was accused of stealing from a gas station, escaped from a work camp in 1967, returned in 1969, went to prison, and was released on parole in 1971. He was on parole from Colorado's prison system in July of 1973, when Linda O'Keefe walked out of Lincoln Intermediate and turned toward home. At the time of her murder, he was 26, living in the area, working construction. His name did not appear anywhere in the original Newport Beach investigation. No connection to Linda, no connection to her neighborhood. He was invisible to every detective who worked the case in 1973. After the killing, he left California for Florida. Something happened there, an unspecified criminal incident. Whatever it was enough. James Albert Layton Jr. ceased to exist in any practical sense. James Allen Neal took his place. He drifted back to Colorado eventually. Arrested again in Denver in 1974, returned to prison, paroled again in 1975. After that he moved quietly, one relocation at a time, the old name receding further with each year that passed without a knock at the door. He settled eventually in Monument, Colorado. A quiet town, a quiet street, a retired man living the kind of unremarkable life that attracts no questions from neighbors who have no reason to ask any. Nobody in Monument knew his name had once been something else. And when investigators arrested Neal for Linda's murder and kept pulling the thread, the history didn't stop at 1973. It reached forward. 2 additional victims in Riverside County, 2 young girls, assaulted between 1995 and 2004. 3 decades after Linda, he had kept going. On February 19, 2019, law enforcement officers went to James Allen Neal's home in Monument, Colorado, and placed him under arrest. He was 72 years old. He had been walking free for 46 years. Since the summer of 1973. Since the turquoise van and the cattails and the 11-year-old girl in the dress with the light blue flowers. 46 years of ordinary mornings. While the O'Keefe family buried their dead and Cindy kept her sister's story alive and Newport Beach police kept a photograph on their wall. He was extradited to California and charged with 1 count of murder, with the special circumstances of kidnapping and committing lewd acts upon a child under the age of 14. He pleaded not guilty. For the first time in 46 years, the man who drove the turquoise van was in a cell. The case that had sat on a shelf and run silently through databases and stared out from a photograph on a police department wall had finally produced a defendant. The family had waited 46 years for this. They would not get what they had waited for. James Allen Neal never stood trial. On May 25, 2020, he was transferred from custody to a hospital. An undisclosed illness. No details beyond the basic facts. He was sick, he was hospitalized. There was nothing suspicious about what was happening to him. He was 73 years old and his body was failing, and the courtroom where he was supposed to answer for what he had done to Linda O'Keefe was still waiting for a trial date. On July 22, 2020, James Allen Neal was pronounced dead. He died in custody in a hospital bed without ever having sat in front of a jury, without ever having heard the evidence read aloud in open court, without ever having been forced to occupy the same room as the family of the girl he had left in the cattails 47 years earlier. There was no verdict. There was no sentencing. The charges died with him. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer did not soften it. He said Neal's death robbed the O'Keefe family of the justice they deserved. He said it deprived the investigators of the satisfaction of finally getting their man into a courtroom. The man who had been invisible for 46 years had managed, in the end, to avoid the one thing that all of it had been building toward. He died before anyone could make him answer for it. Cindy Borgeson said she was grateful. Grateful for the work Newport Beach Police had put in across all of those years, across all of those generations of investigators who had picked up the same file and kept going. She said finding a face and a name, finally having something to point to, brought additional closure. Additional, not complete. Additional, because complete was never available. Complete would have required a trial. Complete would have required her parents to be alive to see it. Barbara O'Keefe had been home sewing on July 6, 1973. She had told her daughter to walk. She carried that for 32 years until 2005, when she died without ever knowing who drove the turquoise van. Richard O'Keefe lasted 3 years longer. He died in 2008 the same way, without a name, without an answer, without the thing the investigation had never been able to give him. Both of Linda's parents went to their graves with an open question. Cindy had been a child herself when July 7th arrived and didn't leave. She had grown up alongside it, aged alongside it, and gotten to her 50s before anyone could tell her who was responsible. She got a name. She got a face. She got an arrest. She got the knowledge that the science Jim White had trusted back in 1973 had ultimately done exactly what he had preserved it to do. She did not get a verdict. What the O'Keefe family received, in the end, was the truth without the accountability. The name without the sentence. Confirmation of what had happened to Linda on July 6, 1973, and the identity of the man who had done it. And then they watched him die in a hospital bed before anyone could make it official. Linda Ann O'Keefe was 11 years old. She loved painting and piano and the beach and keeping her room clean enough for her mother to inspect. She put on a dress with light blue flowers and dark blue trim on the last morning of her life, and she called her mother from a school office phone, and she walked out into a California summer afternoon and didn't come home. 47 years later, her sister had a name. It was the most the system could give her. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough.